SNP spokesman Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've said to the Honourable Member for Whittam that she spoke about this being a partisan debate. Of course it's a partisan debate, because you either believe in the right of workers to strike or you don't, so it's clearly a partisan debate. And she spoke about SMEs struggling because of strikes. Well, I can tell her SMEs in my constituency are more worried about their energy bills going through the roof and the lack of government support that's coming down the line from April onwards. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know this is anti-strike legislation. And how do we know this? This is not my words. That's what the Under-Secretary for Scotland said at the dispatch box last week at Scottish Questions. He boasted that his government is bringing in anti-strike legislation, in a rare bout of honesty at the dispatch box. Now, the Base Secretary keeps going on about the minimum ambulance cover, but the reality is this is an attack on millions of public sector workers. Now, the explanatory notes for the bill tell us that this is a manifesto commitment from the Tories about tackling transport strikes. So while they might hide behind that manifesto commitment, that commitment was nothing to do about clamping down the NHSs, about clamping down on teachers. So the claim is about safety. As I said earlier on, the word safety isn't used once in the bill or explanatory notes. The reality is this is an ideological war in unions that the Tories somehow think will curry them favour with the public. It's a misty eye looking back at Margaret Thatcher taking on the NUM, a battle she won, but a battle that resulted in the closures of mines, communities devastated and thousands of workers put in the dole. If we really want to get back to sacking workers and putting them in the dole, because that's what this is all about. And we know it's an ideological war because in this period of Tory governments, they've already given us the Trade Union Act in 2016, introducing voting thresholds, and then last year with the legislation that allows employers to hire agency staff to break strikes. So there is no doubt this government wants to end strikes, which effectively removes the ultimate backstop in collective bargaining. Now, this bill facilitates an attack on workers, but also for employers to potentially sue unions for damages. So no wonder it's opposed by the TUC, the STUC, Unison, BMA, RCM, RCN, amongst others, and I certainly support them in opposing this. Now, this legislation is nothing more than attacking democracy, an attack on the rights of workers to withdraw their labour, and a further attack on devolution. Neither the Scottish or the Welsh governments want this legislation, but yet again it's going to be imposed on the devolved nations. In Scotland, this is further proof that the Westminster straitjacket does us no good at all. We could have had employment and workers' rights devolved, but unfortunately Labour resisted these powers coming to Scotland. But now, even the STUC has called for devolution of employment rights to Scotland, so maybe Labour should consider that instead of listening to Gordon Brown's rehash of broken promises. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's worth noting that this bill does not impact Northern Ireland, because employment law is already devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly. So yet again, the so-called most powerful devolved parliament in the world, the Scottish Parliament, has got less powers than the Northern Ireland Assembly, and this proves it. Now, this ideological attack comes from someone who, as Transport Secretary, the unions confirmed was absolutely non-existent in terms of dialogue and communications. Somebody who was blocking the DFT from agreeing deals, and now with that same person in post, leading the charge for anti-strike and anti-worker legislation. Now, given the Secretary's form, we know he's up for a fight. And it's a fight, though, that even if he wins this, he's destroying worker relationships for good. Hard-pressed workers struggling at times with the pressures they're under, particularly within the NHS. So who seriously thinks not negotiating and threatening workers with a sack for striking is going to help matters going forward? It's utterly insane. And as the rail unions have pointed out at the Transport Select Committee last week, deals have been agreed where DFT and the UK ministers are not involved. So clearly the union ask cannot be too unreasonable. When RMT and ASLEF have agreed deals with ScotRail and Scottish Government, they've agreed deals in Wales and Merseyrail, for example, deals with governments and authorities who are hamstrung by Tory austerity imposed on them and still manage to agree deals. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Tories tell us they're the party of workers. Now, that phrase fools no one, but they also tell us they're all about a high-wage, skilled economy. And yet, as we've heard, when workers ask for a wage rise, they're told no. They're told it's unaffordable. And worse, in the case of the rail unions, the Secretary of State quotes figures he thinks shows how well paid all rail staff are. Now, as actually it's really telling, the Secretary is effectively saying that train drivers are overpaid and how dare they ask for a wage rise. It's insulting beyond belief. So the Tories can forget saying they want a high-wage economy, but meanwhile they're quite happy for the rail companies to make dividends and pay dividends during the pandemic. They're quite happy for VTech to walk away from the LNR franchise owning billions of pounds, but yet they always go for attacking the workers. Now, in terms of rhetoric, it's the same that rhetoric around this legislation that the Secretary says mirrors what happens elsewhere in Europe. Soundbites for the Secretary of State are actually easily proven to be false.
Hear, hear.
And indeed, the European Public Sector Union General Secretary Jan Willem Gudrian argued that the comparisons by the UK Government of this bill with existing laws in other EU countries was misrepresenting the situation. And this is because all minimum service levels are agreed through negotiation in Europe. But also the European Trade Union Council General Secretary Esther Lynch said, the UK already has the most draconian restrictions on the right to strike in Europe, and the UK Government's plans would push it even further away from normal democratic practice across Europe. Now, Pablo Sanchez can tell us, a spokesperson for the European Federation of Public Service Unions, he was much more succinct. He said it's bollocks. So the Secretary of State should reflect on what the true position is of this proposed legislation against what's happening in Europe. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it would also seem that this legislation is in breach of Article 11 of the ECHR, especially with regard to proportionate action. Richard Arthur, Head of Trade Union Law at Thomson Solicitors, said that the bill raised very serious legal question marks and anticipates legal challenges under Article 11 of the European Convention of Human Rights and Convention 87 of the International Labour Organization. And he has also rightly pointed out that the Human Rights Memorandum that accompanied the Transport Strikes Bill set out reasons why minimum service levels were not justified in fire services, health settings and education, and yet this is now what the Government proposed. So by default, this Government's now going against their own previous human rights opinion. So what kind of madness is this going forward? And when it comes to the international labour organisations, which the Secretary keeps liking to reference, then their idea of minimum service requirements are clearly intended to be based on endangerment of life, personal safety or health. But this wide-ranging legislation coming forward goes way beyond these parameters. And the ILO makes it clear there should be an independent arbitration body, but yet this bill is completely silent on an arbitration body, so why is that? It's clear that any minimum service is supposed to be just that, a bare minimum. We've got no idea what this Government is going to raid through when it comes to statutory instruments. Statutory instruments that cannot be amended, and the last time there was a Government defeat in a statutory instrument was in 1979. So we know all power rests with the Government on this, and as Liberty observe, this bill itself does not create any form of minimum service. And Liberty also confirm that MPs debating this legislation at second reading will not know exactly what they're voting for. So all the Tory MPs in here that are going to take part in today's debate and then trot through the lobby are doing so blind to what the future legislation and regulations will look like in terms of minimum service. It's an affront to democracy. And Mr Deputy Speaker, any Tory MP that says they care about parliamentary sovereignty cannot possibly vote for this bill. Now, the bill is actually made worse by the Henry VIII power, which allows amendment and revocation even of future legislation not yet passed. And we can see how they're ramming this through Parliament with minimum security and a proposed programme motion of just 5 hours for committee stage. So it really is assault on democracy. And the fact that this bill comes into effect immediately once it's passed, and so work notices and action can be taken by employers for strikes that have already actually been voted through, then that shows just how ridiculous it is, and it's an assault on these workers. Now, the impact assessment for the Transport Strikes Bill observes that on a strike day in July 2022, 20% of rail services were still in operation. So right away that would suggest to me there was a minimum level of service operating. So What do the Tories really think is a minimum service, given that they seem to be saying 20% running is not a bare minimum? And there's actually huge ramifications here for rail workers overall in particular, because if this government forces through a high threshold of minimum service, then strikes by signalmen and track operatives will effectively be banned, because a high minimum service is going to force all these guys to work to keep the tracks in operation and the trains running. So they're effectively block and strike the back door there anyway. And what will minimum service look like for teachers? Where does this come in this whole talk about safety? And what happens to train companies that can't provide a minimum service at the moment, especially if union members decide not to work on their rest days and work to rule? Where's that going to leave this government in terms of minimum service level obligations? Now, the overview of the bill and explanatory notes does make it quite clear that the ability to sack workers is a key aspect of this bill. Now, this is the polar opposite of what was said when the Transport Strike Bill was listed in the Queen's Speech of December 2019, where it was stated that workers wouldn't be discriminated. So why do they now threaten people with their livelihoods? And it's also clear, despite what the Secretary says, this legislation will allow employers to target those that they think is part of an awkward squad, allowing employers to decide who has to work and notify strike days. So that clearly infringes on workers' rights to withdraw labour. So instead of what previously we had illegal blacklisting by some companies, employers can now name workers who they want to break a strike and sack them if these workers stay true to their beliefs. So how can that be deemed acceptable? And the second aspect is the proof that this has nothing to do with minimum cover by ambulance staff, as the Secretary likes to remind us. And it also ignores the fact there is an existing 1992 Act, Section 240, as my old friend keeps saying, which allows for preserving life and limb, which unions have their own practices to comply with that legislation. And of course, for fire services, the Secretary could utilise the Fire and Rescue Services Act 2004 if he felt the desire to do so. So it's crystal clear this legislation is not required. It's an attack on democracy and the right to strike. It will prolong industrial disputes, not resolve them, allows individual workers to be targeted in work notices, and it's actually politically stupid. You've got to wonder, why is the Tory government looking to antagonise something like 7 million workers across these sectors? And it's also an astonishing level of incompetence to bring in legislation that potentially allows them to sack essential workers in these vital sectors where there's already a shortage of skilled workers. And the public can see through a government who partied while clapping the nurses and now threatens them with the sack. So they need to follow the lead of the Scottish Government and get round the negotiating table. The resolution of the ScotRail dispute has been commended by both RMT and ASLEF. There are no strikes planned in the health service in Scotland, and the health pay deal being implemented by the Scottish Government is one that the UK Government should replicate as a starting point when they get round the negotiating table. But it's outrageous, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Scottish Government have been negotiating in good faith with the unions and now going to have this legislation foisted upon them. Legislation that we don't even know if Westminster will use to force work notice through in Scotland against the wishes of the Scottish Government. Legislation that could ruin otherwise good working relationships in Scotland. Employment law should be devolved to Scotland, but that in itself would now just be a sticking plaster. It's perfectly obvious that what Scotland now needs is the full powers of a normal, independent country.